Close your eyes. Let your breathing slow. Tonight we travel to the western Mediterranean, to the year 218 before Christ, to a world balanced on the edge of a knife. Rome in this year is not yet an empire. It is a republic, governed by 2 elected consuls who serve for a single year, supported by a senate of several hundred aristocrats who hold office for life, defended by a citizen army of farmers and craftsmen who take up their weapons when the season of war begins and return to their fields when it ends. Rome controls most of the Italian peninsula, the Latin cities of the plain, the Samnite hill tribes of the interior, the Greek coastal settlements of the south. It is powerful, disciplined, and confident. It has recently, after 23 years of brutal naval warfare, defeated the city of Carthage in the First Punic War, stripped it of its island territories, and imposed a heavy financial indemnity. Rome considers the matter settled. Carthage does not. Carthage sits on a promontory on the North African coast, in what is today Tunisia, looking out across the deep blue of the Mediterranean towards Sicily and Spain and the long southern coast of Europe. It was founded, according to tradition, by Phoenician settlers from the city of Tyre, on the coast of what is now Lebanon, around 800 before Christ, making it roughly contemporary with the founding of Rome itself. For 6 centuries, Carthage has grown wealthy on trade. Its merchant ships moved tin from Britain and silver from Spain and grain from Sicily and dyed cloth from Tyre and slaves from every coast across the Mediterranean world. Its harbors are the finest in the ancient world, great curved basins capable of sheltering hundreds of ships simultaneously, with warehouses and dockyards built along the inner shore. Its city walls extend for more than 20 miles around the peninsula on which the city stands. Its population numbers in the hundreds of thousands, larger, perhaps, than Rome itself in this period. It is not a minor city. It is not a weakened power. It is one of the great civilizations of the ancient world, and it has, at this particular moment in history, a general. His name is Hannibal Barca. He is 29 years old. He has been fighting wars since he was a teenager, riding with his father's army in Spain from the time he was 9, learning the craft of generalship from one of the finest commanders of his generation. He has spent the last 8 years consolidating Carthaginian power in the Iberian Peninsula, fighting hostile tribes, negotiating alliances with friendly ones, training and shaping an army that has become, in the years of his command, one of the most effective fighting forces in the ancient world. He is, by any measure of the evidence, one of the most gifted military commanders who has ever lived. He has also, since childhood, hated Rome. Settle in. Let the room grow quiet around you. This is his story. To understand Hannibal, we must understand what came before him. Carthage, in the 3rd century before Christ, is a civilization built on commerce. Where Rome built its power through conquest and the absorption of defeated peoples into its political system, Carthage built its power through trade. Carthaginian merchants were everywhere in the ancient Mediterranean world. In the markets of Greece and Egypt and Spain, along the Atlantic coast of Africa, in the tin mining regions of Cornwall in the far northwest. Carthaginian coins have been found as far east as Central Asia. The Carthaginian alphabet, derived from the Phoenician, was the ancestor of the Greek alphabet, which became the ancestor of the Latin alphabet, which you are reading now. Carthage controlled, in its greatest period, the coasts of North Africa, from the Atlantic to Libya, the southern coast of Spain, the islands of Sicily and Sardinia and Corsica, and the trade routes that connected them all. Its navy was the finest in the ancient Mediterranean, large, disciplined, crewed by professional sailors who had been going to sea for generations. Its army, by contrast, was composed largely of mercenaries, soldiers recruited from across the Mediterranean world and beyond, Numidian cavalry from the African interior, Spanish infantry, Gallic warriors, Balearic slingers, professionals who fought for pay rather than for homeland. This would prove in time a source of both strength and weakness. The First Punic War began in 264 before Christ over the island of Sicily. The island sits in the middle of the Mediterranean, visible from both the Italian and African coasts on a clear day, and whoever controls it controls the sea lanes of the central Mediterranean. Both Rome and Carthage understood this. A minor conflict between two Sicilian cities drew Rome into the island's affairs, and Rome's involvement drew Carthage into a confrontation, and the confrontation became a war that neither side had planned and neither knew how to end. Rome had never been a naval power. Its army was formidable. The legion system, the combination of discipline and tactical flexibility, the sheer willingness to absorb casualties and keep coming back, had made Rome the dominant land power in Italy. But at sea, at the start of the First Punic War, Rome had almost nothing. Carthaginian sailors had been sailing these waters for centuries, in ships refined over generations to the peak of ancient naval technology, crewed by men who had grown up on the water. The Romans dealt with this problem in a characteristically Roman way. They captured a Carthaginian warship that had run aground, a quinquereme, a large galley propelled by 5 banks of oarsmen, and used it as a model to build 120 copies in 60 days. They then invented a device called the corvus, a boarding bridge with an iron spike on the end that could be dropped onto an enemy ship, pinning it in place and allowing Roman soldiers to board it and fight the kind of land battle that Rome knew how to win. The first major naval engagement using these new ships at a place called Mylae in 260 was a Roman victory. The war lasted 23 years. Rome and Carthage fought across Sicily and at sea and in North Africa, and neither side could find the decisive blow that would end it. Carthaginian fleets won victories, and Roman fleets won victories, and storms destroyed both. Entire Roman fleets, hundreds of ships, tens of thousands of men, were wrecked by Mediterranean storms and lost. The Romans built new fleets. Carthaginian armies fought brilliantly in Sicily for years without achieving a result. The war simply continued, grinding both sides down until Carthage, exhausted, its treasury depleted, its mercenary soldiers unpaid and beginning to mutiny even before the final peace, accepted harsh terms. Carthage surrendered Sicily. It agreed to pay Rome 3,200 talents of silver over 10 years. It withdrew from the western Mediterranean islands. And in the years immediately after the peace, when Carthage was struggling to suppress a revolt of its unpaid mercenaries, a brutal internal war that the ancient sources describe with horror. Rome seized Sardinia and Corsica as well, islands not mentioned in the peace terms, taken simply because Rome could take them and Carthage was too weakened to resist. The man who commanded Carthage's armies in the final years of the First Punic War, brilliant in the field, undefeated in Sicily, even as his city negotiated surrender, was Hamilcar Barca, Hannibal's father. Hamilcar signed the peace and returned to Carthage and spent the next decade suppressing the mercenary revolt, which he did with ferocious efficiency. And then he began rebuilding Carthaginian power in Spain. Hamilcar spent 8 years in Spain, extending Carthaginian control through a combination of battle, diplomacy, and strategic marriage alliances with the local tribal aristocracy. He founded a new city, Acre on the southeastern coast, and began developing the silver mines that would eventually fund the war he was preparing. Hannibal grew up in the camps and on the marches, learning everything there was to learn about how armies moved and fought and were supplied, watching his father navigate the endless complexities of managing a mixed force of mercenaries, allies, and conscripts in foreign territory. Hamilcar died in 229, killed in a battle with the Celtiberian tribe, drowned in a river while covering the retreat of his army. He was perhaps 45 years old. His son-in-law Hasdrubal took command and continued the work, expanding Carthaginian territory, founding a new capital city on the southeastern coast called New Carthage, modern Cartagena, with the finest harbor in Spain and direct access to the silver mines. Hasdrubal was assassinated by a Celtiberian tribesman in 221. By this time, Hannibal was 25 years old and had been a soldier for 16 years. He had been a cavalry commander, a staff officer, a veteran of dozens of engagements across the breadth of Spain. The army elected him to command. The Carthaginian Senate ratified the appointment without significant opposition. Hannibal spent the next 3 years completing the consolidation of Spain south of the river Ebro. The boundary that Carthage and Rome had informally agreed marked the limit of Carthaginian expansion, though the agreement's exact terms were disputed, and Rome would later claim it covered more than Carthage acknowledged. He fought the tribes of the interior methodically, reducing them by battle or negotiation, incorporating their warriors into his army. He learned to manage the extraordinary diversity of his forces: Africans from the Carthaginian heartland, Numidian cavalry from the Saharan margins, Spanish and Celtiberian infantry, Balearic slingers with their long leather slings, who could throw a lead bullet with terrifying accuracy and range. He learned their languages, or enough of them. He ate their food and slept in their camps and went into battle at their head. He was developing, in these years, the quality that would define him as a general: the ability to think from his enemy's perspective, to imagine not just what he would do, but what his opponent expected him to do, and then to do something else. Every great tactical victory Hannibal would win in the years ahead would involve a manipulation of his enemy's assumptions, a trap built from the enemy's own certainties about how battles were fought. The trigger for war came from the city of Saguntum. Saguntum was a prosperous city on the eastern coast of Spain, south of the Ebro, which had placed itself under Roman protection some years earlier, an alliance that Rome cited as making Saguntum a Roman ally, off-limits to Carthaginian interference, even though it lay within the area of Carthaginian influence. Hannibal had been conducting military operations near Saguntum for months, and the Saguntines had sent complaints to Rome. Rome sent ambassadors to Hannibal, warning him to leave Saguntum alone. Hannibal besieged Saguntum in 219. The siege lasted 8 months. The city's defenders fought with extraordinary determination, conducting sorties,
repairing breaches in the walls, holding out long after any reasonable expectation of relief. There was no relief. Rome had forces committed elsewhere and moved slowly. When Saguntum finally fell, Hannibal distributed the plunder to his troops and sent the most valuable captives and treasure to Carthage. Rome sent an embassy to Carthage demanding that Hannibal be surrendered for trial and punishment. The leading Carthaginian senator, Hanno the Great, a political enemy of the Barca family who had opposed the Spanish venture from the beginning, rose in the council and argued that Carthage should comply. He was outvoted. The Carthaginian Senate refused the Roman demand. Rome declared war in 218.
In the spring of 218 before Christ, Hannibal set out from New Carthage with an army of roughly 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants. African forest elephants, smaller than the Indian elephants used by Alexander's enemies, but still immense and terrifying to any soldier who had never encountered them, capable of crushing a man or a horse, and of breaking any formation that did not know how to deal with them. He was going to march over the Alps. The plan was audacious beyond any precedent. A march of 1,500 miles from Spain to northern Italy, crossing two mountain ranges, through territory controlled partly by hostile Gallic tribes, to place his army in the heart of Italy before Rome understood what was happening. The strategic logic was sound. Rome's power rested on its Italian allies, the cities and tribes of the peninsula, whose soldiers filled the legions. If Hannibal could reach Italy and win battles there, he could strip those allies away and collapse Rome from within. But the logistics of getting there were nearly impossible. The march through Spain went smoothly enough. The Carthaginian territories were well supplied, the army moved efficiently, and Hannibal's years of campaigning had given him deep knowledge of the terrain. The Pyrenees were a harder crossing. The mountain passes were defended by hostile tribes, and Hannibal had to fight his way through. Several thousand soldiers deserted in the foothills, men who had signed up for a Spanish campaign and had no intention of marching to Italy. Hannibal let them go. He wanted only those who were committed. By the time he reached the Rhone River in late summer, in what is now the Languedoc region of southern France, his army had shrunk to about 50,000 infantry and 9,000 cavalry. These were the men who remained after the desertions and detachments, professionals, veterans, men who had been soldiers for years and who trusted their commander in a way that went beyond ordinary military loyalty. The Rhone crossing required solving several problems simultaneously. The river was wide and fast, running high with late summer flow from the Alps. Local Gallic tribes, the Volcae, were drawn up in war formation on the far bank, prepared to contest the crossing. And the elephants, 37 of them, large and unpredictable, refused categorically to enter the water. Hannibal sent a cavalry detachment of about 500 men upstream by night, with orders to cross on improvised rafts, circle around the Volcae's position, and attack from the rear at a prearranged signal. The following morning, as the main crossing began and the Volcae were focused on repelling boats loaded with soldiers, the cavalry struck from behind. The Volcae, caught between two forces, broke and fled. The crossing continued. The elephants required different management. Hannibal's engineers built enormous floating platforms of timber and earth, structures essentially indistinguishable from the riverbank, covered in turf and soil, large enough for several elephants to stand on comfortably. The platforms were anchored to the bank while the elephants were coaxed onto them. When each platform was loaded, it was cut loose and poled across the river. Most elephants crossed without incident, too confused by the situation to panic. Some, midway across, did panic, lurching off the platforms into the current. Their riders plunged in after them or simply held on as the elephants found their footing on the riverbed, raised their trunks above the water, and waded or swam to the far shore. Then Hannibal turned east toward the Alps. He followed the Rhone Valley north for several days, through territory controlled by friendly or neutral Gallic tribes, before turning east into the foothills. The Celtic Allobroges, who controlled the approaches to the passes, had initially intended to oppose the crossing. Hannibal learned from informants that they were positioned in force above a narrow defile that the army would have to pass through. He sent his own light troops forward the night before, occupied the heights above the Allobroges' position, and when the Gauls attacked the next morning, they found themselves attacked in turn from above. The ambush became a rout. The army continued upward. The path narrowed. The weather changed. The mountain air grew cold in ways that soldiers from Spain and North Africa and the African interior had never experienced. The crossing of the Alps took 15 days. 15 days that reduced an army of 50,000 to roughly 20,000, that killed more soldiers than any battle Hannibal had yet fought, that became, in the memory of the ancient world and in the imagination of every age since, one of the great acts of human will in the face of the natural world. We do not know exactly which pass Hannibal used. Ancient sources name different routes. Modern historians have argued the question for 2 centuries, and the consensus, such as it is, points to passes in what is now the border region between France and Italy, the Col du Clapier or the Col du Mont-Cenis, both of which reach above 8,000 feet, and both of which would have been crossable in early autumn, barely, by a determined army with adequate supplies. The physical conditions were what you might expect. The path, never wide to begin with, narrowed as the army climbed until in some places it was a ledge cut into the rock face, wide enough for 2 men walking abreast, but not for horses walking side by side. Loaded pack mules lost their footing on the loose scree and fell. Long falls into the valleys below, taking their loads with them, food and equipment and weapons spinning into the void. The horses were frightened by the unfamiliar terrain and the altitude and became difficult to manage. Men fell. Not many, not compared to what was coming, but enough that the army began to understand that the mountain itself was an enemy. The mountain tribes were worse, the Centrones, the Caturiges, others whose names the sources do not agree on. These were peoples who had lived in the high passes for generations and knew every path, every cliff, every point where the terrain forced a column to bunch together and slow. They attacked at night, stealing horses and pack animals. They rolled boulders down from above onto the column, vast rocks that crushed men and animals and started small avalanches of loose stone. They attacked the rear guard in defiles where the narrow path made formation, fighting impossible, and the advantage lay entirely with the defenders. Hannibal responded by doing what he always did, thinking clearly about the psychology of his enemy. The mountain tribes attacked the rear of the column, where the baggage and the elephants were, and they attacked at night or from positions of cover. He addressed this by a simple reversal. He marched with the baggage and elephants at the front of the column, protected by the bulk of the army, and rested each night in a fortified camp at a defensible high point. The tribes continued to harass the flanks, but their most effective tactics had been neutralized. Near the summit, the army encountered snow. Early autumn in the high Alps can bring the first significant snowfall, and in the year 218 it came early. The army climbed through fog and light snow for several days, the path growing increasingly difficult to trace, the cold settling into men who had spent their lives in Spain and Africa and had no conception of what sustained cold at altitude felt like. Then, near what must have been the final approach to the summit, they found the path blocked. The snow of the previous night had fallen on older snow that had partially melted and refrozen into ice. The slope was steep and the surface was glass, and the army could not move on it without falling. Men and horses who tried to advance slid backward, sometimes for long distances, sometimes off the edge of the path entirely. Hannibal halted the army. Ancient sources describe what followed in vivid detail, how his engineers identified a large outcropping of rock that was blocking the best available alternative path, how fires were built against the rock to heat it, how vinegar, which the Roman sources say was poured on the heated rock to accelerate the fracturing, was used to break the stone apart, how the debris was cleared and the path laboriously widened over the course of several days. Whether every detail of this story is accurate, the army did find a way through. It emerged from the summit section and began the descent on the Italian side. The descent was in some respects worse than the climb. The slope going down was steeper, and the ice made it treacherous. Men who had survived the hostile tribes and the storms and the altitude found themselves sliding helplessly down the path, unable to stop, crashing into the men ahead of them. Horses fell. Elephants, heavy, top-heavy on a slope, were nearly impossible to control on the ice. Near the bottom, a section of the path had collapsed, probably from a late summer landslide, and the army spent 3 days building a rough new track around the gap, cutting into the mountainside by hand with the tools they carried. And then, on the 15th day, Hannibal halted his army at a place where the slope finally flattened and the view opened up, and below them, still distant but unmistakably there, green and warm in the late autumn sunlight, lay the plain of the Po River, and beyond it, eventually, Rome. Of the 50,000 infantry who had entered the Alps, perhaps 20,000 emerged. Of 9,000 cavalry, roughly 6,000 remained. Of the 37 elephants, most were still alive, though weakened by cold and altitude and the exertions of the crossing. Hannibal had lost more than half his army in the mountains, without fighting a single formal engagement. What remained was something different from what had started. A smaller force, but one that had survived something extraordinary, that had proven to itself and to its general that there was no obstacle it could not overcome if Hannibal said it could be overcome. They followed him down into Italy. The Romans had not been idle during the months of Hannibal's march. The Senate had dispatched 2 consular armies, the maximum force Rome could field in a single season, to deal with the threat. One army, commanded by the consul Publius Cornelius Scipio, the father of the general who would eventually destroy Hannibal, was sent to intercept the Carthaginian force in southern France. Scipio arrived at the Rhone to find that Hannibal had already crossed and was heading for the Alps. He sent his army to Spain under his brother's command to cut off Carthaginian supply lines and turned back to Italy with a smaller force to meet Hannibal when he emerged from the mountains. The first engagement of the Italian campaign came at the Ticinus River in November of 218. A cavalry skirmish in which Hannibal's Numidian horsemen, far superior to the Roman cavalry in individual skill and maneuverability, drove the Romans off the field. The consul Scipio was wounded and, according to one tradition, was saved from capture by his 17-year-old son, the future Scipio Africanus, who charged forward alone into the Carthaginian cavalry to reach his father. Scipio, the father, pulled his army back across the Po and waited for his consular colleague, Sempronius Longus, who was marching north from Sicily with the Second Roman Army. Sempronius arrived with approximately 40,000 men, combining with Scipio's damaged force to give the Romans a substantial numerical advantage. The two armies, Hannibal's veterans of the Alps and the combined Roman force, faced each other across the Trebia River, a tributary of the Po, in December of 218. Sempronius was eager. His term of office expired in January, and with it his command. And he desperately wanted a victory he could take back to Rome before he became a private citizen again. He had conducted successful raids across the river and believed, with some justification, that his troops were performing well. He believed, with rather less justification, that he understood Hannibal. Hannibal understood Sempronius very clearly. The morning of the battle, Hannibal had his own men fed and prepared before dawn. A full breakfast, warm food, oil rubbed into their limbs against the cold. Then he sent his brother Mago, with 2,000 picked infantry and cavalry, to hide in the dense vegetation along the riverbank downstream from the crossing point, in the rushes and willows that grew thick along the Trebia's edge. Mago had been there since before midnight, lying in the cold with his men, waiting. At first light, Hannibal's Numidian cavalry crossed the river and rode up to the Roman camp, shooting arrows and shouting insults, a provocation carefully calibrated to make a proud Roman commander feel that he could not ignore it without dishonor. Sempronius took the bait. He ordered his entire army to cross the river immediately, in pursuit, without eating breakfast. It was December in northern Italy, and the Trebia in December ran cold and fast with snowmelt from the Alps. The Roman soldiers waded into it chest deep, 40,000 men, and crossed to the far bank wet and shaking and hungry in the early morning cold. Hannibal's army was waiting for them in battle formation, fed and warm. The battle that followed lasted several hours. Hannibal's infantry met the Romans in the center, his cavalry overwhelmed the Roman horsemen on the flanks, and at the critical moment, when the Roman line was fully engaged and fully committed, Mago's 2,000 soldiers rose from the reeds and struck from behind. The Roman formation collapsed, the center dissolved first, then the flanks. Men ran for the river. More than 20,000 Romans died, in the battle, in the river, in the cold fields beyond it. The following spring, Hannibal moved south through Etruria, the region of modern Tuscany, on a march designed as much to provoke the Roman consul Flaminius as to reach any particular objective. He avoided fortified towns and moved through the countryside, burning farms and villages, letting the smoke of burning buildings mark his passage across the landscape. Flaminius was a populist consul who had been elected on a platform of aggressive Roman virtue, the kind of man who believed that boldness was its own strategy. He was precisely the type of commander Hannibal could work with. When Hannibal's army disappeared into the hill country around Lake Trasimene in Umbria, moving fast enough that the Roman scouts could not keep track of it, Flaminius followed. Lake Trasimene is a large lake in the hills of Umbria, the largest lake in central Italy, set in a landscape of wooded hills that drop steeply to the water's edge. On its northern shore, a narrow path ran between the lake and the hills, wide enough for a marching column, but not wide enough to deploy a battle line. The hills were wooded and provided excellent concealment. Hannibal moved his army into the hills on the afternoon and evening before the battle, positioning different contingents at intervals along the northern shore. His Spanish and African heavy infantry at the far end of the defile to block the Roman advance, his Celtic warriors and cavalry along the hillsides above the middle of the path, his light infantry on the heights above the entrance to the defile. Then he waited. He waited for fog. The morning of the 21st of June, 217 before Christ, mist rose from the surface of the lake in thick white banks that reduced visibility to a few yards. Flaminius led his army along the northern path in column of march, the standard formation for movement through confined terrain, not a battle formation. The fog was dense enough that the soldiers in the middle of the column could not see either its head or its tail. Hannibal's signal, a trumpet call, some accounts suggest, others a fire, went out when the Roman column had fully entered the defile. 40,000 Carthaginian soldiers rose from concealment on the hillsides above and charged downward simultaneously all along the length of the path, attacking the Roman column from 3 sides at once. The Romans had no time to form any battle line. They had no room. They could not see what was happening through the fog. Those near the front of the column tried to fight and were pushed backward by the press of their own terrified men behind them. Those in the middle had no idea what was happening and nowhere to go. The lake was on one side, the hillside was on the other. The enemy was above and ahead and behind. The battle lasted roughly 3 hours. It was not so much a battle as a slaughter. Methodical, systematic, the inevitable result of 40,000 men in the wrong place at the wrong moment. Flaminius was killed in the press of the fighting, cut down by a Celtiberian warrior who recognized him and fought through to reach him. 15,000 Romans died in the defile and on the hillside. Another 15,000 were driven into the lake and drowned or were taken prisoner wading in the shallows. Almost nothing escaped. An hour after the battle ended, a relief force of 4,000 Roman cavalry was arriving along the path on the southern shore of the lake. They had heard nothing. The fog had muffled even the sounds of combat. Hannibal's cavalry intercepted them and killed or captured the entire force. Rome had now lost 2 armies in 5 months. The road to Rome itself lay open, or very nearly open. A delegation of Carthaginian cavalry rode south and reportedly got close enough to the city to see its walls before turning back. The gates of Rome were barred for the first time in living memory. The Senate met in emergency session. They appointed a dictator, Quintus Fabius Maximus, a man of 60, a senior aristocrat of the old school, a man who had studied war and had thought carefully about this particular war. Fabius had reached a conclusion that flew in the face of everything Rome believed about itself, that Rome could not, at this moment, defeat Hannibal in open battle. Not because Roman soldiers were inferior, but because Hannibal was operating at a level of tactical genius that Rome had not yet learned to counter. Every time Rome had tried to fight Hannibal directly, it had lost. The only sensible response was to stop fighting him directly. Fabius followed Hannibal's army through the mountains of southern Italy, always staying on high ground, always refusing to be drawn into the flat terrain where Hannibal's cavalry could operate freely, always harassing, ambushing foragers, cutting off stragglers. He never attacked. He never gave battle. He watched and waited and wore down Hannibal's army at the margins while denying it a decisive engagement. The Romans called him cunctator, the delayer. They did not mean it as praise. The Battle of Cannae, fought on the 2nd of August, 216 before Christ, is still studied in military academies around the world. It is, by most measures, the most complete tactical victory in the history of warfare. A battle in which a smaller force destroyed a larger one so thoroughly and so finally that the larger force essentially ceased to exist as a fighting unit. Fabius's term as dictator had expired. 2 new consuls had been elected. Lucius Aemilius Paulus, a careful aristocrat who had argued for caution, and Gaius Terentius Varro, a populist who had campaigned on a platform of aggressive action. They had been given the largest army Rome had ever assembled. Approximately 8 legions, supported by Italian allied troops, totaling around 86,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry. There was enough food in the supply wagons for a long campaign. There was enough political pressure behind them to make caution politically impossible. Hannibal had selected his battlefield with care. The plain near the small town of Cannae in Apulia in southeastern Italy was flat and open, exactly the terrain that favored his cavalry and put the mass of Roman infantry at a disadvantage. He positioned his army with a river, the Aufidus, at the Roman left and open ground to the right, limiting the Romans' ability to extend their flanks. Hannibal had roughly 50,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry. The Romans had 86,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry. On the straightforward mathematics of the situation, Rome should have won. The key to what happened was geometry. A geometry so elegant and so devastating that it has been reproduced on paper and in sand by military students for 22 centuries. Hannibal placed his weakest troops, his Spanish and Gallic infantry, in the center of his line, in a convex formation that bulged forward toward the Romans. On the 2 wings of this central infantry mass, he placed his best African infantry, the veterans of years of Spanish campaigning, in 2 relatively thin columns facing outward. On the flanks, his cavalry, the heavy Iberian and Celtic horsemen on the right, the lighter but highly skilled Numidians on the left. When the battle began, the Roman legions did what Roman legions always did and had always been trained to do. They pushed forward into the enemy's center, driving hard, using their weight and their discipline and their armament to grind through the opposition in front of them. The Carthaginian center retreated, deliberately in good order, maintaining its formation, drawing the Romans forward and inward. The convex formation became gradually concave, like a bow bending under pressure. The Romans pushed harder, pressing their advantage, driving deeper into what looked like a collapsing enemy. They were walking into the pocket. On the flanks, things were going badly for Rome. The Iberian and Celtic cavalry on the right swept away the Roman horsemen opposing them. The Roman cavalry was heavily outnumbered and less skilled than the Carthaginian. The Numidian cavalry on the left engaged the Italian allied cavalry in a long, swirling fight that kept them occupied and off the field. And then the African infantry, the two columns on the wings of the Carthaginian center, turned inward. They had been standing relatively still while the Spanish and Gauls retreated and the Romans poured into the space between them. Now they pivoted, facing into the mass of Romans that had pushed past them on both sides. The front of the Roman advance was blocked by the remnants of the Carthaginian center. The sides were now attacked by the African veterans, and the Iberian cavalry, having driven the Roman horsemen from the field, swung around the Roman army and struck from behind, where the Italian allied cavalry was still engaged with the Numidians. The trap closed. 86,000 Roman and Italian soldiers found themselves packed into a shrinking space, pushed from all directions toward the center, unable to maneuver, unable to retreat, unable even to raise their weapons properly as the press of their own panicking comrades pushed them together. Ancient sources describe men suffocating, men falling and being trampled by the soldiers behind them who had nowhere else to step. The killing lasted, by most estimates, 3 to 4 hours. Between 47,000 and 70,000 Romans and Italians died at Cannae. Among the dead was the consul Aemilius Paulus, who had argued for caution and was overruled, killed fighting on horseback in the last phase of the battle. Among the dead were 80 former senators, 29 of the 48 military tribunes, 2 quaestors, the governing class of the Roman Republic, the men whose families had run the state for 300 years, lay in the dust of an Apulian wheat field. Hannibal walked the battlefield when it was over. Ancient sources describe him weeping, whether from grief or exhaustion or the sheer overwhelming scale of what he had done, we cannot know. His cavalry commander, the Numidian nobleman Maharbal, came to him in the hours after the battle and urged an immediate march on Rome. The road was open. The army was intact. If they rode through the night and the following day, they could be within sight of Rome's walls within 5 days, before the city could organize a defense, before the psychological shock wore off, while Rome was still reeling from the most catastrophic military defeat in its history. Hannibal considered the proposal. He said no. Maharbal looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Truly, the gods do not give all their gifts to one man. You know how to win a victory, Hannibal. You do not know how to use one." The question has been debated for 2,000 years. Why did Hannibal not march on Rome after Cannae? Those who defend his decision point to the practical obstacles. Hannibal had no siege equipment, the heavy catapults and battering rams and siege towers that would be needed to breach Rome's walls, which were thick and ancient and had been built to resist exactly this kind of assault. A siege of Rome, even a successful one, might take months or years. During that time, Hannibal's army would be stationary, dependent on supply lines stretching back to Carthage across the Mediterranean, vulnerable to attack from new Roman armies being raised in the city he was besieging and from the Italian allies who had not yet defected. Hannibal had won 3 brilliant victories in the field. He had not yet won the war, and besieging Rome was not the same thing as winning battles. Those who condemn his decision, and Maharbal was only the first in a long line of critics, argue that all of these practical obstacles existed, but that in the days immediately after Cannae they were overwhelmed by the psychological reality of a city in shock. Rome had just lost a quarter of its governing class in a single afternoon. The streets were full of mourning women. The gates were barred. Priests were consulting omens and finding bad ones. The surviving consul Varro arrived at the nearby town of Venusia with 50 survivors and sent a message to Rome that read, in essence, "Everything is lost." In those hours and days, the argument goes, the obstacles were secondary. A Roman citizen looking from the walls and seeing Hannibal's army in the distance might well have concluded that resistance was impossible. The city might have surrendered, or key men within it might have opened a gate, or the Senate, reduced and shattered, might have sent ambassadors and accepted whatever terms Hannibal offered. We will never know. What we know is that Hannibal chose a different strategy. His strategy was to break Rome's alliance system rather than attack Rome directly. Rome's power rested not on the city itself. Rome could survive a siege, had survived worse, but on the network of Italian allies whose soldiers filled the legions and whose agricultural surplus fed the state. There were more than 300 such allied communities in Italy, ranging from large cities like Capua to small Samnite hill towns, all bound to Rome by a variety of treaties and arrangements that dated back 3 generations. If Hannibal could persuade them that Rome was finished, that their future lay in a Carthaginian-dominated Italy rather than a Roman one, then Rome would be isolated, its supply of soldiers cut off, its economic base stripped away. After Cannae, some defected. Capua, the second largest city in Italy, a wealthy Campanian city of perhaps 90,000 people, went over to Hannibal in the autumn of 216. The decision was not unanimous. There was a substantial pro-Roman faction in the city, and the debate was bitter. But Capua's leading men made their calculation and chose Hannibal. Several other cities in Samnium and Apulia followed. Philip V of Macedon, who had been watching the war with interest, sent ambassadors to negotiate an alliance. Hannibal entered Capua in triumph and established his winter quarters there. He had been in the field, essentially continuously, since leaving New Carthage more than 18 months earlier. His men rested in Capua's warm houses, ate its food, enjoyed its famous baths and entertainments. Roman sources later claimed that the winter at Capua ruined the Carthaginian army, that the comforts of civilization corrupted Hannibal's soldiers and broke the edge of their fighting spirit. This is almost certainly Roman propaganda. The army that emerged from Capua in the spring of 215 fought as effectively as it had before. But Rome did not collapse. The Latin cities, the core of the Italian alliance, cities like Tibur and Praeneste and Tusculum that had been Roman allies for 3 centuries, held. The Roman Senate, meeting in a city half empty with grief, sent no embassy to Hannibal. The surviving consul Varro, who had arguably caused the disaster at Cannae by forcing the engagement, was met at Rome's gates not with recrimination, but with formal thanks for not despairing of the Republic. New legions were recruited, slaves were freed and armed, men below the usual military age and above it were drafted. Rome recalled its armies from Spain and Sicily and consolidated its forces in Italy under new commanders. And Rome officially adopted the strategy of Fabius Maximus, the strategy that had been derided as cowardice before Cannae, as the policy of the Republic. For the next 13 years, Hannibal remained in Italy. Think about that. 13 years. Hannibal entered Italy in the autumn of 218 and did not leave until the autumn of 203. For 13 years he campaigned across the length of the peninsula, from the Po Valley to the toe of the Boot, from the Adriatic coast to the Tyrrhenian Sea. He wintered in friendly cities, marched in spring, fought in summer, retreated to defensible positions in autumn. He never once returned to Carthage or to Spain. His supply lines, such as they were, consisted of whatever Carthage chose to send by sea, which was never enough, and whatever he could take from the Italian countryside. He never lost a major battle in Italy. This is not a qualified statement or a rhetorical flourish. It is a fact. In 13 years of Italian campaigning, Hannibal was not defeated in a single significant engagement. He won at Trebia, he won at Trasimene, he won at Cannae, he won a dozen smaller engagements across the peninsula. When Roman armies tried to bring him to battle on open ground, he destroyed them. When Roman armies refused battle and harassed him at the margins, the Fabian strategy, he moved away from them and found new ground. But he was no longer winning the war. Rome's strategy of attrition was working precisely as Fabius had designed it. The Italian cities that had defected to Hannibal after Cannae were being retaken one by one, not through pitched battle, but through siege. Rome's enormous manpower advantage meant that it could send armies to besiege Capua and Tarentum and the other defected cities while still keeping forces in the field to shadow Hannibal's main army and prevent him from relieving the sieges. Hannibal could march to Capua's relief, and Rome would lift the siege, but only temporarily, only until Hannibal moved away again. Rome had the resources for a long siege. Hannibal did not have the resources to maintain a permanent army at Capua's gates. In 211, Capua fell. The siege had lasted 2 years. When Roman forces finally entered the city, they executed the leaders of the pro-Carthaginian faction, dissolved the Capuan Senate, confiscated the territory of the city, and enslaved significant numbers of the population. Capua would not recover its former prominence for generations. The message to every other Italian city that was contemplating its options was unmistakable. Hannibal's army, through all these years, received almost nothing from Carthage. This was partly logistics. Sending a significant army across the Mediterranean while Rome's navy patrolled the sea lanes was genuinely difficult, and partly politics. The Carthaginian political establishment was divided. Hanno the Great and his faction had opposed the war from the beginning and continued to oppose it, arguing that money spent on Hannibal's Italian venture would be better spent defending Carthage's African territories. Barca family supporters pushed for reinforcement and were repeatedly outvoted or outmaneuvered. The army that had crossed the Alps, the veterans of 15 years of Spanish campaigning, the soldiers who had survived the Pyrenees and the Rhone and the 15 days in the snow, was aging. The men who had been in their 20s at the Trebia were now approaching 40. New soldiers were recruited locally, Italian volunteers, Gallic warriors, men from the communities that had defected, and they were good soldiers, trained to Hannibal's standards. But they lacked the extraordinary coherence of the original force, the quality that comes from years of shared experience. In 207 before Christ, Hannibal's brother Hasdrubal made his move. Hasdrubal had been commanding Carthaginian forces in Spain since Hannibal's departure for Italy. He had spent years fighting a defensive campaign against Rome's Spanish armies, holding the Iberian territories, maintaining the silver supply that partially funded the war. Now, with the Spanish position deteriorating, Rome's commanders in Spain were increasingly effective. He gathered the best of his forces and began the march that his brother had made a decade earlier. He crossed the Pyrenees. He crossed the length of France. He crossed the Alps. He descended into the Po Valley in the spring of 207 with an army that, while smaller than Hannibal's original force, was still formidable. Perhaps 30,000 men, including Ligurian and Celtic allies recruited along the route. He sent messengers south to find Hannibal and coordinate a junction of their forces. The messengers were intercepted by Roman patrols. The Roman consul Marcus Livius Salinator was in northern Italy with one army. His consular colleague Gaius Claudius Nero was in southern Italy, shadowing Hannibal's main force. When Nero read the intercepted messages, which detailed Hasdrubal's position, his route, and his intention to meet Hannibal, he made a decision of extraordinary boldness. He stripped his southern army of its best troops, approximately 7,000 men, force-marched them 300 miles north in 7 days without Hannibal knowing they had gone, combined them secretly with Salinator's army, and attacked Hasdrubal at the Metaurus River before the brothers could join. The Battle of the Metaurus, fought in June of 207, lasted most of a day. Hasdrubal's army was outnumbered and outmaneuvered. When his Ligurian and Celtic allies began to break under the Roman pressure, Hasdrubal rode into the midst of the fighting and was killed, cut down by a Roman soldier who either recognized him or simply happened to be in the right place. Nero marched back south before Hannibal knew he had been gone. A few days after the battle, a small group of Roman riders approached Hannibal's camp. They threw something over the wall. Hannibal's soldiers brought it to him. It was his brother's head. Hannibal looked at it for a long time. According to one ancient source, he said that he recognized in that face the fate of Carthage. He withdrew to the Bruttian Peninsula, the very toe of Italy, the farthest corner from Rome, and remained there for the next 4 years. He was still undefeated. He was also now truly trapped. The man who would finish the war had been watching it from the beginning. His name was Publius Cornelius Scipio, and he was, in the year 210 before Christ, 25 years old. His father, the consul Publius Cornelius Scipio, who had been wounded at the Ticinus, who had been saved, perhaps, by his teenage son riding into the Carthaginian cavalry, had been sent to Spain after recovering from his wounds to command Rome's forces there. His uncle Gnaeus Scipio had been with him. Both had been killed in Spain in 211, caught separately by Carthaginian forces in engagements that destroyed their armies. The young Scipio had been present at the beginning of the Italian campaign. He had served as a military tribune at Cannae, one of the officers who survived the battle and, in the hours and days afterward, helped organize the surviving Romans, refused to allow talk of flight or surrender, held the broken army together until it could be withdrawn to the nearby city of Canusium. He had been at the lowest point Rome reached in the war and had helped prevent it from going lower. He had spent the years since watching and thinking. He had access to military writings, to the histories of earlier campaigns, to the after-action analyses that Roman officers produced after defeats as well as victories. He had thought more systematically than perhaps any Roman of his generation about why Hannibal won, what the double envelopment actually required, what the psychological conditions for it were, how a commander set it up. He had concluded essentially that Hannibal's genius was replicable. Not the intuitive brilliance, perhaps, but the method, the positioning of forces, the deliberate manipulation of the enemy's assumptions, the use of cavalry to close the trap. These were things that could be learned and applied. When Rome needed a commander for Spain in 210, no senior officer wanted the job. Spain was where good commanders went to be killed. The Senate, in some desperation, opened the command to anyone who would volunteer. The young Scipio stepped forward. He was technically not of consular age. The appointment was legally questionable. The Senate approved it anyway. Scipio went to Spain with about 28,000 men and a strategic plan that was, in its audacity, worthy of his teacher. Rome had been fighting a cautious defensive war in Spain for years, trying to hold the line and prevent Carthaginian reinforcements from reaching Italy. Scipio had a different idea. He would attack the center of Carthaginian power in Spain, not the armies in the field, but the city of New Carthage itself. New Carthage was Carthage's Spanish capital, the base from which the Spanish armies were supplied, the city where the most important hostages from Spanish tribal leaders were held, the location of the treasury and the military warehouses. It was defended by a substantial garrison and was considered, by the Carthaginians, essentially impregnable. The 3 Carthaginian field armies in Spain were each more than 10 days' march away. Scipio marched south along the coast in early spring with his entire army and appeared before New Carthage in the morning of a day when the Carthaginian field commanders thought he was still in his winter quarters near the Ebro, 300 miles to the north. He assaulted the walls on multiple fronts simultaneously, and he personally led a force across a lagoon that was supposedly too deep to wade. Information from local fishermen had suggested to him that a north wind in the afternoon would lower the water level enough to make it crossable, which it did, allowing his men to reach an unguarded stretch of wall and scale it while the defenders were occupied on the other sides. New Carthage fell in a day. Scipio released the tribal hostages, which brought most of the wavering Spanish chieftains over to Rome's side. He distributed the treasury to his troops. He kept the military warehouses intact and used their contents to supply his campaigns. Then he did it again, and again, and again. Over 4 years, fighting a series of engagements that systematically dismantled Carthaginian power in Spain, Scipio cleared the peninsula. He used Hannibal's own tactics, the double envelopment at Baecula, the elaborate deception at Ilipa, the manipulation of enemy expectations that he had studied so carefully, and he applied them with growing confidence. Hasdrubal escaped from Spain before Ilipa and made his fatal march to Italy. The 2 remaining Carthaginian commanders were defeated separately. By 206, Carthage's Spanish adventure, the project Hamilcar Barca had begun 30 years earlier, was over. Scipio returned to Rome and was elected consul for 205. He was 31 years old. He went to the Senate with a proposal that many of the senior men there, Fabius Maximus prominent among them, considered reckless to the point of folly. Hannibal was still in Italy, still undefeated. The obvious course was to continue the Fabian strategy, contain Hannibal, wear him down, wait him out. Scipio proposed the opposite: take the war to Africa. Land in Carthage's home territory, march on the city, and force Carthage to recall Hannibal from Italy. Fabius argued against it at length. The risks were too high. If Scipio's African expedition failed, Rome would be in a worse position than before. Let the strategy that was working continue to work. Scipio countered that the strategy that was working was also endless. Hannibal had been in Italy for 13 years. He might be there for another 13 or 30, slowly bleeding the peninsula while Rome bled itself dry, maintaining the armies to contain him. The only way to end the war was to force a decision, and a decision could only be forced in Africa, where Carthage's survival was at stake. The Senate compromised. Scipio was given Sicily as his province, with permission to cross to Africa if he judged it appropriate. He spent the winter of 205 training his army, volunteers, many of them veterans of Cannae who had been stationed in Sicily as a kind of punishment posting and were desperate to redeem their reputation. In 204, he crossed to Africa. Scipio landed near the city of Utica on the North African coast in the early summer of 204 before Christ. He had roughly 35,000 men, a large army by Hannibal's standards, though smaller than the forces Rome had put in the field at Cannae. He besieged Utica, established a fortified camp, and began the process of assembling allies. The key ally was Massinissa, a Numidian prince who had fought for Carthage in Spain and had reason to hate the Carthaginian faction that had stolen his kingdom. Massinissa brought cavalry, Numidian cavalry, the finest light horsemen in the ancient world, the same Numidians whose skill had been decisive at Cannae and Trasimene and Trebia. Scipio had learned from those battles. He intended to have the Numidians on his side this time. Carthage sent Hasdrubal, son of Gisco, and the Numidian king Syphax against him with a combined force of perhaps 80,000 men, more than double Scipio's numbers. They camped near Utica and settled in for what they expected would be a slow siege of Scipio's fortified position. Scipio sent an embassy to open peace negotiations. The negotiations were, from his perspective, a deception. His representatives spent weeks in the Carthaginian camp, mapping it, observing the layout, counting the guards, learning the routines. Then Scipio broke off the negotiations, citing Carthaginian bad faith, and in a single night attacked both camps simultaneously. Both camps were built primarily of wood and reed, standard construction for a temporary camp in North Africa. Scipio's men set them on fire at several points simultaneously. The camps burned. Soldiers who ran from the flames found Roman and Numidian cavalry waiting for them. Perhaps 40,000 men died, by ancient estimates. Hasdrubal and Syphax escaped, but could not reassemble their armies. Scipio won 2 more engagements in rapid succession, and by the autumn of 204, Carthage was in a state of crisis. The Carthaginian Senate sent emergency messages to their commanders in Spain and Sicily and Italy, and in the winter of 203, they sent a message to Hannibal: "Come home." Hannibal had been in Italy for 15 years. He had won at Trebia and Trasimene and Cannae and a dozen smaller battles. He had demonstrated beyond any possible doubt that the Roman legions could not defeat him in open battle. He had spent 15 years waiting for Carthage to send the reinforcements that would let him finish the job, and the reinforcements had never come in adequate numbers. He had watched his army age and shrink, watched the Italian alliance he had built after Cannae crumble under Roman pressure, watched his brother's head arc over the wall of his camp. He had not been defeated, but he had not won. He sailed from the Bruttian coast with the veterans who remained, perhaps a few thousand of the original Alpine army, the rest Italian and Gallic and African soldiers recruited during the Italian campaign. They crossed the Mediterranean and landed at Hadrumatum on the North African coast. Hannibal was on African soil for the first time in 36 years. The two armies met in the early autumn of 202 near a town called Zama, in what is now Tunisia. Hannibal had roughly 36,000 infantry, 4,000 cavalry, and 80 war elephants. Scipio had about 34,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry, including Massinissa's Numidians. The meeting between the two commanders before the battle is one of the great moments in ancient history, recorded by Polybius, who had access to men who had known participants, and by later writers who may or may not have had reliable sources. Hannibal and Scipio met between the lines with interpreters and talked. Hannibal spoke first. He proposed terms. Carthage would surrender all its overseas territories, Spain, the islands, everything outside Africa, and pay an indemnity. Carthage would remain an independent city in Africa, reduced but alive. He spoke, according to the sources, with candor about his own situation. He was 50 years old, he said, and had learned from experience that fortune was unstable and not to be trusted. Scipio responded that the preliminary peace terms Carthage had already agreed to and then violated were more favorable than what Hannibal was now offering. There was nothing to discuss. The battle began the following morning. Hannibal's opening was the elephants. He sent all 80 of them forward in a broad line, hoping to disrupt the Roman formation before the infantry lines met. But Scipio had studied the use of elephants, had seen it at Baecula and elsewhere in Spain, and had prepared his men specifically for this. The Roman infantry opened gaps in their formation like gates swinging open, and the elephants were channeled down these corridors between units, harassed by missiles from the flanks, most of them continuing through the Roman formation and off the field rather than into it. Those that panicked turned back toward the Carthaginian lines and caused chaos in the Carthaginian cavalry on the flanks, which were swept off the field by Massinissa's Numidians and Scipio's Italian horse. The infantry lines met in the center and fought. They were evenly matched, Hannibal's African veterans against Scipio's experienced legions. Neither line could break the other. The battle hung in balance for what felt, to those fighting, like a long time. Then the cavalry returned. Scipio's horsemen, having chased the Carthaginian cavalry from the field, circled back and hit the Carthaginian infantry from the rear. The encirclement, the same geometry that had worked at Cannae, closed around Hannibal's army. 20,000 Carthaginians died at Zama. 20,000 were taken prisoner. Hannibal escaped with a small force of cavalry, riding for the coast. It was the first major battle he had ever lost. Carthage sued for peace. The negotiations moved quickly, both sides understanding what the terms would be. Carthage would surrender its entire fleet except for 10 warships, a force too small to threaten Rome, but enough to defend the harbor. It would give up all overseas territories, Spain, the islands, every foothold it held outside Africa. It would pay Rome 10,000 talents of silver over 50 years, an indemnity so large that it would consume a significant fraction of Carthaginian tax revenue for 2 generations. And it would agree to make no war on any people without Roman permission, which in practice meant it would agree never to make war again, since Rome would not permit it to fight anyone. Carthage signed. The Second Punic War was over. Hannibal was not surrendered to Rome. The Roman terms in this respect were less harsh than they might have been. Scipio, it is said, argued that a general of Hannibal's caliber, who had kept faith with his city through 15 brutal years when a lesser man would have made a private peace, deserved better than to be led in chains through the streets of Rome. Whatever the reasoning, Hannibal remained in Carthage. He returned to a city diminished in every sense. Its fleet gone, its empire gone, its treasury committed to decades of repayment, its military power reduced to the 10 ships and whatever land forces it could maintain within the tight constraints Rome had imposed. Carthage was alive, barely, a shadow of what it had been. Hannibal set about rebuilding it. He was elected suffete, the chief magistracy of the Carthaginian Republic, roughly equivalent to a Roman consul, in 196 before Christ, 3 years after the war. He found a city whose public finances were in chaos. Years of war expenditure and the beginning of the Roman indemnity had left the treasury nearly empty, the public accounts manipulated and poorly kept, the revenue system riddled with opportunities for corrupt officials to enrich themselves. Hannibal attacked these problems with the same systematic efficiency he had applied to military logistics. He audited the accounts. He prosecuted corrupt officials. He reformed the tax collection system. He found money, enough to pay the first installments of the Roman indemnity, that the pessimists had said did not exist. He was, in short, doing exactly what his city needed, and doing it well. The Romans watched him with deep unease. Hannibal, alive and active, even in peacetime, even in a diminished city, represented something they could not quite accept. His brilliance, the brilliance that had destroyed their armies and killed their senators and spent 15 years demonstrating that Rome was not invincible, was not something they could easily set aside. When complaints reached Rome from Hannibal's domestic enemies in Carthage, accusing him of corresponding with Rome's enemies in the east, the Senate sent a delegation to Carthage to investigate. Hannibal understood what the delegation meant. He did not wait for its conclusions. In 195 before Christ, he left Carthage for the last time. He took a small ship from the coast at night, sailing east with a few trusted companions, and did not return. The last 20 years of Hannibal's life were a long, slow diminishment. He went first to Tyre, the ancient Phoenician city on the Lebanese coast, ancestor of Carthage, the ultimate origin of everything the Carthaginian civilization had been. He received a welcome there, a city still proud of its history and its connections to the great daughter city across the sea. But Tyre was not a place to build a base of operations. It was a memory of what Carthage had come from, not a foundation for what might come next. From Tyre he went to Antioch, the capital of the Seleucid kingdom, the largest of the successor states that had emerged from Alexander the Great's empire, controlling territory from the Aegean coast of Asia Minor across the Middle East to the borders of India. Its king, Antiochus III, called the Great, with some justification, was the most powerful monarch in the eastern Mediterranean world, and he was then engaged in a careful assessment of whether to challenge Rome's growing power in Greece and the eastern Aegean. Hannibal offered his services. He had studied the strategic situation with his usual clarity, and his analysis was not wrong. Rome was extending its power into the east. The Greek states were restive under Roman influence, and there was a window in which a determined coalition, Seleucid military power, combined with Carthaginian naval expertise combined with Greek resentment of Roman interference, might check Rome's expansion before it became uncheckable. What was required was for Antiochus to commit fully to the confrontation, to use his enormous resources decisively, and to coordinate his strategy with the other potential partners. Antiochus listened to Hannibal's proposals with interest and then did none of these things. He fought Rome in a half-hearted way, was defeated at the Battle of Magnesia in 190 before Christ, and agreed to peace terms that required him to surrender all his territories west of the Taurus Mountains and to hand over any enemies of Rome who had sought refuge at his court. Hannibal was not on the list of those handed over. He had fled before the treaty was concluded, but the message was clear enough. He went to Crete, which was then a haven for various political exiles and adventurers, and spent some time there before moving on to the court of Prusias of Bithynia. Bithynia was a small kingdom on the southern shore of the Black Sea, in what is now northern Turkey, and Prusias was a minor king of modest military ambitions. He was, at this time, engaged in a border war with his neighbor Eumenes of Pergamon, another minor king who happened to be a close Roman ally. Hannibal commanded Prusias's fleet in this war and, according to ancient sources, won a naval victory by a method that was characteristically his own. Prusias's fleet was outmatched by Eumenes's ships. Hannibal had his men collect as many live snakes as they could find in the surrounding countryside. They filled large clay pots with the snakes, dozens of pots sitting on the decks of Prusias's warships. When the fleets engaged, Hannibal ordered the pots catapulted onto the enemy ships. The Pergamene sailors, suddenly confronted with hundreds of live snakes coming over the rail, panicked. The battle, such as it was, ended quickly. It was the last military victory of his life. He was, by this point, perhaps 60 years old, commanding a small fleet in a forgotten border dispute between two minor kingdoms, in a corner of the world that no one much cared about. He had crossed the Alps with 50,000 men. He had destroyed 3 Roman armies. He had walked the great plain of Apulia the morning after Cannae and seen 40,000 Roman dead. He had spent 15 years in Italy and never been beaten. And now he was here. The Romans never forgot him. Their agents tracked him wherever he went. Every king who sheltered him received, sooner or later, a diplomatic communication from Rome suggesting that the continued presence of Hannibal at his court was incompatible with friendship with Rome. Prusias was no different from the others. In 183 before Christ, Prusias began making arrangements to surrender Hannibal to Rome. Hannibal had survived for 35 years after Zama by staying one step ahead of exactly this moment. He had fled Carthage before the Roman delegation arrived. He had left Antioch before the peace terms could name him. He had moved from court to court, from Crete to Bithynia, staying useful enough to his hosts to be worth protecting, but never secure enough to stop watching over his shoulder. He was 64 or 65 years old, and he had been a fugitive for nearly 2 decades. When his informants told him that Prusias had made his decision, that the king's guards were being positioned around the villa where Hannibal had been staying, that the roads were being watched, that the harbor was being closed, Hannibal tried to find a way out. There was none. Prusias had been thorough. Ancient sources described the villa where he was staying as having 7 exits, each connected to a different passage. A precaution Hannibal had taken years earlier, in recognition that he might someday need to leave quickly. Each exit, when his messengers checked, was guarded. There was no way out. Hannibal sat down and wrote a letter. To whom the sources disagree, perhaps to Prusias, perhaps to the Bithynian Senate, perhaps to no one in particular, but simply because he had always communicated precisely and felt that the moment required some record. He wrote that Rome's word was worth nothing, since they could not even allow an old man to die in peace of old age in a foreign land. He wrote, or so the ancient sources claim, some version of the statement that has been attributed to him ever since. Let us relieve the Romans of their long anxiety, since they find it tedious to wait for an old man's death. He took the poison. He had carried it with him for years. Ancient sources say it was hidden in a ring, one he wore every day. He had been prepared for this moment for a long time. He died in Bithynia in 183 before Christ, approximately 64 or 65 years old. In the same year, on the other side of the Mediterranean, the Roman general Scipio Africanus, the man who had defeated him at Zama, the only commander who had ever beaten him in a major battle, also died in exile from Rome, the victim of political enemies who had prosecuted him on charges of corruption. 2 of the greatest soldiers of the ancient world, dying in the same year, both of them in exile, both of them in some sense abandoned by the cities they had served. Hannibal had kept his oath for 60 years. He had been Rome's enemy from the age of 9 until the day he died. He had come closer than any commander before or since to breaking the power of the city that would go on to dominate the Western world for 500 years. He had done it with an army cut off from reinforcement, fighting in enemy territory, without the political support of his own city, on nothing but his own genius and the loyalty of the men who followed him. He had not been enough. Rome had been something extraordinary, not just one army or one general or one strategy, but a civilization with an almost biological capacity to absorb destruction and keep rebuilding, to learn from defeat and apply the lesson, to sacrifice an almost unimaginable number of men and keep sending more. Hannibal had killed 100,000 Roman soldiers, and Rome had replaced them. He had killed the governing class of the Republic at Cannae, and the Republic had replaced them. He had spent 15 years demonstrating that Roman armies could not beat him in the field, and Rome had simply stopped fighting him in the field and beaten him everywhere else. Perhaps that was his legacy. Perhaps the 15 years he spent in Italy, pressing Rome to its limits, forcing it to find reserves of will and flexibility and ruthlessness that it had not known it possessed, made Rome what it became. The republic that survived Hannibal was harder and more capable than the republic that had stumbled into the First Punic War. It had learned, at enormous cost, how to fight and lose and rebuild and fight again. It had learned from Hannibal himself the tactics that Scipio used at Zama. It had learned from the long attrition of the Italian years the patient strategic vision that would allow it to absorb the Greek world and the Seleucid world and the Ptolemaic world in the following century. Perhaps Rome needed Hannibal to become Rome. It is late now. Close your eyes, let Hannibal rest. The boy who stood at the altar and swore his oath and kept it for 60 years without flinching. The young general who looked at a mountain range with 50,000 men behind him and decided to go through it rather than around it, because going around it was what his enemy expected. The commander who walked the field at Cannae in the gathering dark, past 40,000 Roman dead, and wept. For what exactly we do not know, and perhaps he did not either. The old man in the foreign court with the ring on his finger, who had been carrying the means of his own death for years as a final act of sovereignty, the one thing Rome could not take from him. Let the army rest, the soldiers of the Alpine crossing, the men who had been in Spain with Hamilcar and Hasdrubal before Hannibal, the Numidian cavalry who could ride in a way that the Romans had never seen before and could not counter, the African heavy infantry who held the wings at Cannae while the Gauls and Spanish retreated and drew the Romans in, the Spanish slingers and the Libyan spearmen, and the Gallic warriors with their long swords. The men who spent 15 years in Italy and were never defeated, and grew old in the field, and finally sailed home to fight one last battle on African soil, and lose for the first time in their lives, at Zama, in the autumn of their lives and their generals. Let the Romans rest, all of them. The 86,000 at Cannae who did not come home, the men at Trebia who waded through a December river without breakfast and died in the cold water, the soldiers who fell at Trasimene in the fog on the shore of the lake, who never saw what hit them, the senators who met in the days after Cannae and refused to surrender, who sent their sons and their freedmen and their slaves because they had no one else to send. Fabius, who was right and was called a coward. Scipio, who was brilliant and who died in exile, in the end, like the enemy he had beaten. The farmers and the smiths and the fishermen who kept coming back, year after year, levy after levy, war after war. Let Carthage rest. Let the city that stood for 6 centuries and built a civilization of trade and language and art and seamanship rest in the North African earth where it was laid. The city that Rome destroyed 50 years after Zama, razed, burned, the population killed and enslaved, the harbors filled with rubble, the land cleared. The tradition that the Romans salted the earth so nothing would grow is probably a later invention, but the destruction was real. Nothing remains of ancient Carthage above the surface of the ground. Beneath a suburb of modern Tunis, archaeologists have found the foundations of the harbor, the traces of the warehouses, the fragments of mosaics that once decorated wealthy houses. From time to time, a construction crew digging for a new building finds something, a coin, a shard of pottery, a small carved figurine, and the city surfaces briefly before going under again. The Western Mediterranean, after all of this, belonged to Rome. What Hannibal had fought to prevent, he had perhaps only delayed. Perhaps there was never any alternative. Perhaps Rome's capacity to absorb and rebuild and return was simply too great, and the outcome was always going to be what it was. Or perhaps not. Perhaps one different decision, at Cannae, on the morning after marching south, would have changed everything. Perhaps the world that did not happen is very close to the surface, just beneath the world that did, like the ruins of Carthage beneath the suburb of Tunis. Perhaps Hannibal could feel it sometimes, in the years of exile, the weight of the road not taken. We cannot know. The dead do not explain themselves. The road that was not taken leaves no trace. Let the long dream of Carthage drift away. Let the armies rest. Let the fires go out, one by one, across the plains of Italy and Africa and Spain, and sleep.